If you walked into the Apollo Theatre in Harlem during the 1960s, you'd see a man on stage who moved like nobody else, spinning, dropping to his knees, screaming until his voice cracked, sweat pouring down his face. A cape draped over his shoulders as he pretended to collapse, only to throw it off and explode back into the song. His name was James Brown, and he wasn't just performing, he was surviving. This is James's journey from an outhouse in rural Georgia to owning his masters, from picking cotton to defining funk, from a prison cell to the stage that became his church. This is the story of a man who refused to be owned by anyone ever again. And perhaps for the first time, you'll understand why he had to work harder than anyone else just to stay free. May 3rd, 1933, in a one-room shack near Barnwell, South Carolina, James Joseph Brown Jr. was born. His parents were desperately poor. His father, Joe, worked whatever jobs he could find, turpentine camps, lumber yards, anything. His mother, Susie, picked cotton. They had nothing. The shack had no electricity, no running water, an outhouse in back. James grew up in extreme poverty that's hard to imagine now. When he was 4, his parents separated. His mother left, just gone one day. James never fully recovered from that abandonment. His father took him to Augusta, Georgia, living in his Aunt Honey's house, which was actually a brothel. James, age 5, 6, 7, grew up in a whorehouse, saw things no child should see. Learned early that everything had a price, that survival meant hustle, that nobody gave you anything. He shined shoes on the street, danced for coins, sang for nickels, whatever brought money. Augusta was segregated, brutal. Black people lived on one side, white people on the other, and you knew your place, or you got hurt. James learned to read people, to perform, to make white folks comfortable enough to give him their change. By age 12, he was picking cotton in the Georgia heat. Backbreaking work for almost no money. "I swore I'd never be poor again," he said later. "I'd do anything not to be poor." At 15, he started stealing. Small stuff at first, clothes from cars, food from stores, then bigger, breaking into cars. In 1949, at 16, he was caught, arrested for armed robbery. The judge looked at this black teenage boy from the wrong side of Augusta and gave him 8 to 16 years in prison. For a first offense, James went to Georgia Juvenile Training Institute, basically a prison. He was 16 years old. Prison was hell, but it taught him discipline. He sang in the prison gospel choir, formed a group with other inmates. Music was the only escape from the violence and degradation. After 3 years, he was paroled in 1952 at 19. The condition, he couldn't return to Augusta, had to stay with a sponsor. Bobby Byrd's family took him in. Bobby Byrd would become his lifelong musical partner and one of the few people James ever really trusted. They formed a gospel group, the Ever Ready Gospel Singers, performed in churches around Georgia. But gospel didn't pay. James needed money. They switched to R&B, renamed themselves the Avens, then the Flames. Bobby Byrd and James Brown, building something from nothing. In 1956, they recorded Please, Please, Please at a small studio in Macon. James sang it like his life depended on it, desperate, pleading, raw emotion that didn't sound like anything on the radio. The song was pure need. King Records in Cincinnati picked it up, released it, and it became a hit. Not huge, but enough. James Brown was 23 and had his first taste of success. But King Records owner Syd Nathan controlled everything: the recordings, the money, James's career. James was making hits but seeing almost no money. He'd escaped poverty and prison only to find himself owned by a record contract. This would drive everything that came after. The late 1950s and early 60s, James toured relentlessly. The chitlin circuit, black theatres and clubs across the South and Midwest, where black performers could work. Brutal schedule. 300-plus shows a year. James developed a reputation, tightest band in the business, most dynamic performer anybody had ever seen. He didn't just sing. He danced, moved, spun, dropped to splits, screamed, fell to his knees. Every show was a religious experience. He called it the hardest working man in show business, and he meant it literally. While other artists did 45-minute sets, James did 2 hours, sometimes 3, until he collapsed from exhaustion. In 1962, against King Records' wishes, James recorded a live album at the Apollo Theater in Harlem. Syd Nathan thought it was a terrible idea. Who buys live albums? But James believed in it, paid for the recording himself. Live at the Apollo came out in 1963 and became one of the biggest albums of the decade. It captured what James did on stage. The energy, the screams, the famous cape routine where his band would drape a cape over his shoulders as he collapsed. Then he'd throw it off and surge back into the song. Pure theatre. Pure James Brown. The album stayed on the charts for 66 weeks. James became a superstar. But success brought a realization. He didn't own his music. King Records owned his masters, his publishing, everything. He was making them rich while staying relatively poor. This enraged him. A black man from poverty, from prison, making millions for white executives who treated him like property. In 1964, he hired a new manager and started fighting King Records for control. It would take years, but James was determined. Never again would anyone own him. Musically, James was evolving beyond R&B into something new. 1965's Papa's Got a Brand New Bag changed everything. The rhythm was different, emphasis on the one, choppy guitar, horn stabs, James's vocals more rhythmic than melodic. It was funk, though nobody called it that yet. James had created a new sound. And it exploded. I Got You, I Feel Good came next, then Cold Sweat in 1967, the song that fully defined funk. Bass and drums locked in a pocket, horns punching rhythms, James shouting over it all. Nothing sounded like this. Nothing moved like this. Rock was going psychedelic, soul was going smooth. James Brown went to the gut, to the body, to pure rhythm. April 1968. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, cities burned. James was scheduled to perform in Boston the night after. The mayor asked him to perform on live television, broadcast to keep people home and prevent riots. James did it. Performed for a TV audience while the city stayed calm. Next day, he was in Washington, D.C., doing the same thing. James became a symbol, proof that black success was possible, that you could make it without burning it down. But it was complicated. James preached black pride and self-sufficiency, but also work hard, don't complain, which made some activists uncomfortable. He released Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, in 1968. Massive anthem, but also controversial, too militant for some whites, not militant enough for some blacks. James couldn't win. The 1970s were James's peak creatively. Get Up, I Feel Like Being a Sex Machine, Superbad, Funky President. He created the blueprint that hip-hop would sample endlessly decades later. His band was legendary. Bootsy Collins, Fred Wesley, Maceo Parker, the tightest musicians in the world. But James was a brutal band leader. Fined musicians for wrong notes. Fired people constantly. Demanded perfection because he demanded it from himself. His personal life was chaos. Multiple marriages, affairs, children. He admitted to hitting women, something he was never held accountable for properly. His genius didn't excuse his violence. By the late 70s, disco had taken over and James's sound seemed outdated. Younger audiences didn't know who he was. His career was fading. Drugs became a problem. PCP, cocaine. His behavior got erratic. In 1988, everything collapsed. High on PCP, paranoid, he led police on a car chase across state lines. Arrested, sentenced to 6 years in prison. James Brown, the godfather of soul, was back in prison at 55, just like when he was 16. Everything he'd built seemed destroyed. He served 3 years, released in 1991. Came out determined to rebuild, started touring again, smaller venues but still giving everything. The Cape routine at 60 years old, splits at 65. Because performing was all he knew. In the 90s, hip-hop discovered him. Every rapper sampled James Brown, the drum breaks, the horn stabs, the screams. He became rap's foundation. A new generation learned his name. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in its first year, 1986. Received Kennedy Center honors, Grammy Lifetime Achievement. All the recognition, finally. But his personal life remained troubled. Another marriage failed. His fourth wife, Tommy Ray, had a son, James Jr., in 2001 when James was 68. Health was declining. Diabetes, prostate cancer. Money troubles despite decades of hits because he'd been cheated by managers and labels for years. December 25, 2006, Christmas morning. James Brown died of congestive heart failure in Atlanta. He was 73 years old, died working basically, had performed until weeks before, refusing to stop even when his body was failing. His funeral was massive. Public viewing at the Apollo Theatre where thousands lined up to say goodbye. The man who'd started in an outhouse was given a funeral fit for royalty. But even in death there was chaos. Fights over his estate, questions about the will, multiple people claiming to be heirs. Even dead James couldn't rest easy. Today, James Brown's influence is everywhere. Every funk artist, every hip-hop producer, every performer who moves on stage, they're channeling James Brown, the hardest working man in show business, the man who invented funk, the man who refused to be owned. His life wasn't pretty. He was difficult, violent, complicated, but his music was freedom. Pure, sweaty, exhausting freedom. And that music will never die. An empty stage, single microphone in spotlight, a cape draped over a stool. Silence. Then from somewhere, a drum beat, that familiar pocket. And you can see him, young James, old James, every James. Spinning, screaming, collapsing, rising, working, always working. Because work was how you stayed free. Work was how you proved you mattered. And James Brown worked harder than anyone ever had, just to make sure nobody could ever own him again. Some people sing, some people perform. James Brown survived. So how do you remember James Brown? As the godfather of soul who invented funk, or as the man who spent his whole life working to stay free? Share with us in the comments. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another journey through music history's most resilient voices.